Okay, it's great to see so many people here, and it's wonderful to introduce Nathaniel Mackey. And I'm going to start more conventionally by just actually naming and listing his many accomplishments, because it's such a pleasure to read from such a robust set of accomplishments, particularly because they have been gotten over time through tremendously talented and also hard work on Nate's part. He is the author of 6 books of poetry, the most recent of which is Blue Fasa from New Directions. He is about to publish 6 more books of poetry. Not a joke. It's called Double Trio, and it will be out this year from this fall from New Directions. It's a box set of books. He has the ongoing prose work From a Broken Bottle, Traces of Perfume Still Emanate, whose 5th and most recent volume is Late Arcade, and I believe he's reading some of that tonight. 2 books of criticism, one called Discrepant Engagement, the other Paracritical Hinge. Other works, which I will not elaborate on. His honors include the National Book Award for Poetry, the Stephen Henderson Award from the African American Literature and Culture Society, a Guggenheim Fellowship, the Ruth Lilly Poetry Prize from the Poetry Foundation, the Bollingen Prize for American Poetry from the Beinecke Library at Yale, and the Rebekah Bobbitt National Poetry Prize from the Library of Congress. For many years, he taught at the University of California, Santa Cruz. He is currently the Reynolds Prize Professor of Creative Writing at Duke. Nate is a really perfect invitation for the focus of the conference. And as I watched the language shift and as the conference developed over many months, I was really happy to see this kind of bifurcation in the language, that this conference would focus on writers and artists that engage work at the intersections of literature, art, and performance, but also that use the language of these arts to challenge the structures that are dominant. Nate is a wonderful invitation because he's engaged in both of these. He has a very long lifetime of engagement of music in relationship to poetry through language. More recently, I don't know, at least the last decade and a half, he's also engaged in collaborative performances with jazz musicians and experimental musicians. And we're fortunate that he is going to be doing one of these performances on Sunday, 7:30 at the Hugo House with the jazz and experimental musician Marty Ehrlich. So I hope many of you will be able to come to that. I first met Nate. I heard a lot about Nathaniel Mackey when Joseph Donahue was living here in Seattle. So that was my first introduction. I first met him in person, maybe at a couple of conferences, but I met him more significantly when Paul Nelson invited him to Seattle for a residency, and that was in 2011. So I wanted to thank both Joe Donahue for the introduction and Paul Nelson for the residency that really enabled me to meet him and get engaged in his work. He's been at a couple of UW-Bothell events, including a fall Convergence, and I was fortunate to do an interview with him in 2012. One of the things that struck me most about his work as I became more engaged with it was I marveled at its highly integrated aspects, so that you could go from his prose to his criticism to his poetry, and you were in the same worlds. I think that's very hard to do, and it was also what really drew me to his work, that there was this replete engagement with multiple genres that all spoke a little differently but spoke together. What is interesting about that observation is that, this would lead some literary critics to not only say it's highly integrated, but they'd use words like unified or totality. These are words that Nate Mackey really hates. He doesn't want his work to be a totality. He's not particularly interested in it being unified. But nonetheless, this kind of doubleness is really most engaging about his work. Doing the interview with him, one of the things that I experienced was that no statement that I could make that seemed to try to capture or encapsulate stood. It was challenged immediately. So in that sense, that sort of doubleness is my way of experiencing and appreciating the work. I think this phrase that remains really useful in understanding the work is discrepant engagement. And this is an early concept of his, which are described as practices that in the interest of opening presumably closed orders of identity and signification, accent fissure, fracture, incongruity, the rickety imperfect fit between word and world. He is ever alert to reductionist accounts, whether of literature, history, theory, or criticism, and therefore the need for a spectral or phantom remembering of a dismembered past. One of the phrases or ideas that helped me or made me think further about this doubleness in the work, that it feels so integrated, feels so not really unified, but highly integrated, was a statement made by the jazz player Cecil Taylor, who remarked, "The player advances to the area an unknown totality made whole through self-analysis, i.e. improvisation, the conscious manipulation of known material." Taylor's remarks are very telling of Nathaniel Mackey's work. While Mackey would be the first to refuse the concept of totality, it does hover over his ambitious and extensive work. Though importantly, I think, as Taylor formulates it, there is always an unknown in the construction. There is an unknown totality. The other thing I really like about Taylor's statement is that in suggesting that self-analysis and improvisation are interchangeable, he draws attention to how mediums and selves are interrelated. Indeed, far from the self-analysis exercised through predetermined psychological or political objectives, Taylor's remarks manifest the necessary interdependence of personal and medium-specific realizations as they inhere in specific traditions, cultures, and art forms. So I will conclude with a quotation from Nate Mackey, who writes, and this is from our interview, I believe, "An artistic medium isn't only an aspect of culture, but a culture in and of itself, or at least comparable to one. It filters and inflects thought, perception, and expression in particular ways, processes experience and its representations in particular ways, as does a culture. To render one artistic medium in terms of another is to suggest affinities between the two, but it also accents the fact that each is incomplete, subject to augmentation, significantly not the bound whole it might appear to be or presume itself to be. So essentially in cross-media, what we've been discussing this entire conference, there is a challenge of anything that would close down. In summary, I will leave you with Mackey's words. He writes, "Writing is a mix of saying what I mean to say and finding out what else the writing might say." Here's Nate.
Thank you, Jeanne, for that very kind and generous introduction. And let me also thank Amaranth and everyone involved in presenting this conference for the invitation to be here. And for all of you who have made it what it is. Nobody could take in all the panels, but the ones I did take in, I found very exciting and stimulating, and they got me a little bit pumped up. So, you may get some results here. No promises. But I need especially to thank the participants in the roundtable addressing my work that took place yesterday afternoon. Will Alexander, Maria Damon, who I think organized it, Joe Donahue, Jeanne Heuving, and Dee Morris. I couldn't ask for a better preface to this reading. Not all of you were there, but those of you were. It really removed some of the burden of trying to introduce my work as I read it. But it's, one wants to be read, and especially one wants to be read well. And the evidence of having been read well by the 5 participants in that panel yesterday was very moving, very touching. It's a precarious act to send one's work out into the world. And it's reassuring to have had readers such as the ones who presented their ideas and their responses to the work yesterday. So I especially want to thank them. I'm going to read poetry and prose. I'm going to start with prose and read this work from A Broken Bottle, Traces of Perfume Still Emanate, which has been mentioned. It's a series of letters addressed to an angel of dust, by a musician-composer who signs his letters N, period. And I'm especially happy to read from it here, because in a way it started in Seattle. Some of you know Herb Levy, who was a student of mine in my first semester of university teaching back in 1974 at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And we have stayed in touch over the years. And the year following that year, he moved here to Seattle. And I sent him a piece of writing. We were trading stuff. And he wrote back with some questions, which I didn't address directly, and I didn't address him directly. What I sent him was an Angel of Dust letter, the very first Angel of Dust letter. It was subsequently published as Song of the Ondumbulu 5 in Eroding Witness. But anyway, it was the beginning of this enterprise that has now gone through 5 volumes of trying to both flay and make converge a number of different discourses and imaginative and otherwise discursive practices. This was the 70s. It was a time when theory was beginning to ascend in academia, and I was there in academia. And I saw theory as a kind of fiction. I mean, it was certainly speculative. And when I was teaching at USC in the late 70s, the Jamaican historian Robert Hill was somebody I hung out with a bit. And we had a mutual love for the work of the Guyanese writer Wilson Harris, these very densely poetic novels. And a comment that Bobby, we all called him Bobby, made at one point stuck with me. He said, well, Wilson's writing theory. So that chimed. And the idea that theory was also sound. I think it was Houston Baker who said at one point that theory was a particular sound. And so this series of letters really became in some ways my way of doing theory. Great poet and friend of mine, Jay Wright, wrote in one of his letters around that time, theory is the angel of our time. And maybe that's who the angel of dust is. I hadn't thought about it until yesterday. But anyway, these letters written by this musician based in Southern California have to do with the doings of his band. And there's a kind of, I would just, this mix of sound, theory, poetry, fiction, there's a kind of, there's a roving conceptuality about the work, which was informed by things like conceptual art, but also informed by things like Octavio Paz's book on Marcel Duchamp, if you know that work, which is just this monster of propositionality. I mean, it just, it's like, it's like Will Alexander. I mean, it's just monstrous. But anyway, so all this stuff was mixing, and I was trying to get it to, to percolate. And at the same time, I was trying to get my poetry, to be, I don't know, maybe more specific. People were at the time talking about non-referentiality, I later found out, but I was trying to become more referential, even hyper-referential. I wanted to become hyper-specific, so if there was a dead cat, lying on the street in a Safeway shopping bag, which there was on my way home from school one day, I wanted to find some way to get that into my writing. Or I wanted to get all the discographical information that as a discophile I had accumulated over the years. I wanted to find a place for that. And it wasn't coming into my poetry. So this writing became a kind of prose laboratory where I could practice, this hyper-specificity, where I could, name stuff, name records, name particular cuts on records, all under the guise of being a musician working in Southern California with this band. And so some of the roots and some of the things I've talked about can be seen in the evolution of names for this band. They started out calling themselves the Deconstructive Woodwind Chorus. And I didn't want to leave it at that, in that register, because there were a lot of vernacular resources that have always been very meaningful to me that I wanted to be at play as well. So they did a gig in Oakland and thought that maybe that name wouldn't go over, that it might come off as a little Eurocentric. So they changed their name to the East Bay Dread Ensemble. But they were only that for a minute. They later changed their name almost immediately after getting back to LA. they changed their name to the Mystic Horn Society. And they were that for a long time. And then there was some complaint from the women members of the band that that was a highly phallic or phallocentric name. And on the occasion of adding another woman to the band and making it a sextet, 2 men, 3 men, and 3 women, they decided to have a more gender equal name. And so they now call themselves the Molimo Matet. And you'll just have to read one of the volumes, I think it's the 3rd volume, Atet AD, to see how that name works. So anyway, what I want to do is read a couple of letters from the most recent volume, Late Arcade, which came out a couple years ago. It's the 5th volume. And let me introduce you to the band. There's N, whom I've mentioned, who plays reeds, flutes, and trumpet. There's Lambert, who plays reeds and flutes. There's Penguin, who plays reeds and flutes and is especially fluent on oboe and double reed instruments. There's Jamila, who plays piano, synthesizer, and other keyboards, guitar, and she's also a singer. There's Aunt Nancy, who plays violin and bass, and there's Jeanette, who plays drums and percussion. And I'm going to read 2 letters, one from the very beginning of Late Arcade, and these letters often have to do not only with the band's performances, but the band's compositions. And this has to do with a composition written by Jamila, which is it kind of signifies on a composition written by N that is talked about and performed in Bass Cathedral, the volume that precedes this one. One of the things that started happening about halfway through the series to date, I guess that would be an Atet AD, is that on a date, indeed, here in Seattle, at a place called Solstice, there was the first occurrence of the emergence from the instruments of these comic strip balloons that would enclosed writing, inscriptions, usually of a very erotic nature. And audiences were, quite pleased to see this kind of literalization of the music, intrigued and pleased. The band has mixed feelings about it. It's been something that has continued, and it has interesting qualities. The balloons are visible, but they are not photographable or filmable. A sketch artist was brought in to provide a drawing of what you could only call the spirit of the balloons. His name is Bloon. And if you want to get a look at what that looks like, well, it's actually in Late Arcade. It makes a return appearance in Late Arcade, but it first appears in Bass Cathedral, which I think is also out there. So the balloons make an appearance in the second of the 2 letters I'm going to read. And the first has to do with the conceptions underlying this new composition, and the second letter actually talks about the debut performance of the composition. Dear Angel of Dust, Jamila brought a new composition to rehearsal today. It's called Sekhet Aru Struff, a title that immediately, as you can imagine, got my attention, alluding, as it does, to my own Sekhet Aru strut. Putting struff in strut's place, it alludes as well to the piece from which it borrows the term, if it can be called a term, Johnny Diani's The Robin Erlin Struff on the African Bass album he did with Clifford Jarvis a few years back. I'm inclined to say it pointedly alludes to both, albeit its point would appear to be a diffusion of point, an advancement of blur with overtones of slur, tending to dislocate point. What, that is, was Diani getting at with Robin Erlin if not an ambiguation, of Robben Island, a pointedly malaprop version bordering on slur. And doesn't Struff go on in the same vein, subjecting stuff, strut, straw, fluff, bluff, and any number of other phonically related words to an ambiguating fusion and diffusion, upping the ante on the already indefinite stuff. Jamila perhaps had this in mind. Perhaps she meant the replacement of strut by struff as an ambiguating move, a deflationary tack perhaps. However much the replacement of strut diffuses and deflates a certain self-congratulation at the titular level, however much struff does indeed mess with strut, does indeed mush it up, taking the wind out of the sails its apparent pleasure with itself could be said to be. I say perhaps because the music itself does anything but diminish or deride. Struff notwithstanding, it conveys no loss or ratcheting down of dimension, no lack of majesty. It's better perhaps to simply say a certain modesty obtains, the shying away from the presumption self-nomination can't but entail. Struff wants to lighten up, walk lightly, outflank, if not entirely break free from such presumption. Seket Aru Struff's light tread compounds a sense of light as trepidatious gait with a competing sense of light as buoyancy, a saltatory elan, nowhere more notable than in the bounding figure Aunt Nancy sustains on bass. Atop and to a degree at odds with the bass's throb-inflected walk, I pursue a more tentative approach on trumpet, the trepidatious advance adumbrated by Struff's unraveling of Strut's edges, a fraught excursion bereft of any but ad hoc assurances. Jeanette steps away from the traps in favor of bongos and conga for this piece, peppering and otherwise abetting Aunt Nancy's bounding figure while helping propel and punctuating the piece on other fronts as well. Jamila herself plays synthesizer, though presides on would be a more accurate way to put it. So fully does she avail herself and the piece of a sense of ultimacy, majesty, and moment, an incumbent cosmicity, or an abiding ethereality the synthesizer is famously able to impart. The most unusual aspect of the piece's instrumentation is that Lambert and Penguin don't play their horns, assigned instead to something Jamila variously terms extended voice, nodding to Meredith Monk, prepared voice, nodding to John Cage, and amended voice, or further accenting her own intervention, underscoring her nodding to no one if not herself, amended mouth. Each is given a text to read, excerpts from a chapter of the ancient Egyptian Chapters of Coming Forth by Day. Lambert's is taken from chapter 15, a hymn of praise to Ra when he riseth in the eastern part of heaven, which mentions Sekut Aru toward the end. Let him mingle among the heart souls who live in Ta Shesert. Let him travel about in the Seket Aru, conformably to thy decree with joy of heart. Him the Osiris Ani, whose word is truth. Penguins is taken from chapter 110, the chapters of Seket Hetepet, which concerns arrival in Seket Aru and living in the city of Seket Hetepet, e.g., let me go forward, let me plow. I am at peace with the God of the town. I know the water, the towns, the gnomes, and the lakes which are Seket Hetepet. I live therein. I am strong therein. Lambert recites first, then Penguin. By extended voice, prepared voice, amended voice, or amended mouth, Jamila means that Lambert and Penguin each clamp 3 clothespins to their lips for the piece. 2 of them clamped to and hanging down from the sides of the upper lip, one of them clamped to and hanging down from the middle of the lower lip. The aim is to alter their elocution, to pigeonize, as Jamila puts it, the papyrus of Ani. She instructed them not to let it stop simply at that, but to assist the aleatory work done by the clothespins, or, as she sometimes terms it, the amendments, by furthering it, consciously recasting the text at the point of enunciation as universal patois, idiosyncratically conceived. Think of Pharaoh's Japan, she exhorted. Think of the long line of scat behind it. You could do worse than think of Slim Gaillard or of Clark Terry's mumbles, to say nothing of all the Vedic chatter outside the music. You see what I mean by hyper-specific? Lambert and Penguin wondered if Jamila was serious at first. Aunt Nancy, Jeanette, and I wondered as well, especially when Penguin noticed the sentence, "Behold, my mouth is equipped," in the text he was to read, at which point he started laughing and, sure it was all a joke, said to Jamila, "Okay, you got us. Touché." Jamila, though, looked at him as if she had no idea what he meant. Quickly enough, we all saw that indeed she had no idea what he meant. She was nothing if not serious, though she did allow, responding a bit later to a question Lambert raised regarding amendment as endowment versus amendment as obstruction, that the tactic might be viewed as a bit quirky. But who says quirky can't be serious? She rhetorically asked. Lambert and Penguin then approached their parts, in many ways the linchpin of the piece, with all due seriousness, holding any impulse to ham it up, go tongue-in-cheek, or in some other way play for comic effect at bay. Each adopted a damped inflection, whisper-like, but a whisper less in volume than tone, conspiratorial, open, even so, to exhortative, declamatory moments now and again. The clothespins did their job of detour, inhibiting certain habits of pronunciation while enabling alternatives, conducing to a pestered, repercussive manner of speech that did indeed, thanks to the synthesizer's choric hints and Empyrean laminates, seeing the issue of a pigeonizing celestiality, to use Alan Silva's term, universal patois. I need to stress that this wasn't arrived at quickly, that there were a number of false starts and a good deal of trial and error before Lambert and Penguin found the right vocalic balance and blend, the requisite pace and restraint to make it work. As I've noted, Jamila extracted a lush but buried oratorio from the synthesizer, interred, if one could so say it, in the firmament, a streaming advance and a sheeting sweep through the heavens. Solemnity and moment, neither untouched by requiem, were hers to maintain. Universal bounty both mourned and extolled. Swell had to do with it, as did surge, emanation, pulse. Pressed amenities, it was all one could do not to be borne away by. However much, yet all the more, one felt allied. As for my part, it especially fell to me, as I've already said, not to be borne away, to offer an astringent, bounding base and universal bounty could be qualified by. Counterpoise and parry were typically my line's relation to Lambert's and Penguin's readings, moments of convergence not altogether absent. Moot sublimity, all such rally was earned assurances emptying out, a hollowing out. Incertitude vied with assurance, earned assurance, hallowing hitch, hesitation, sputters, recondite remit. Lambert and I, or Penguin and I, as were the trumpet and I, were each the other's hollow extension. We played the piece a good number of times, even after we finally got it down, especially after we finally got it down. I'm enclosing a tape of the best version, as ever, in. And of course, there's no such tape available to the reader. So all these propositions about a music that we don't get to hear. So it's, you know, it's runs and flights of conceptuality. So let me read one that was the third letter in Late Arcade that comes around this time of year in 1983. And it's around the time of John Coltrane's birthday, or the day after John Coltrane's birthday, September 24th. And we're coming up on Train's birthday on Monday. Dear Angel of Dust, more balloons last night. It was during a Coltrane birthday concert we took part in at the Century City Playhouse. A number of bands played, the usual suspects from around town, the Detoxine's Trio, the Boneyard Brass Octet, Sunstick and the Chosen Few, etc. We played a couple of pieces, Sunship and Sekhet Aret Struff. It was our first public performance of Sekhet Aru Struff, and it was during this piece that the balloons emerged. It was actually, to be more precise, during a section towards the end of the piece that was a bit of a detour, a turn towards rumba initiated by Jeanne. We'd been talking about rumba earlier in the day, listening to and talking about an album by Totico, Isus Rumberos, that came out a couple of years ago. So the turn Jeanne initiated didn't entirely come as a surprise. Their rendition of What's Your Name, the old doo-wop hit by Don Juan. Anyone know either version? Yeah, well, there you go. That's my man. I was going to try to play you some of it, but we couldn't get that to work here, but I highly recommend both. Exactly how apt or effective a mesh it is was what we discussed. Opinions ranging from endorsement, even outright rave, a claim that the merger isn't only beautiful, but long overdue, and that the piece is the best on the album by far, Penguin, to reservations regarding the advisedness of literalizing what's otherwise more subtle, productively so, otherwise more dynamically understated, Jeanne. It wasn't entirely a surprise then, as I've said, when Penguin came to the end of his recitation and Jeanne began to beat out a guaguancó rhythm on the conga, not only beating out the guaguancó, but singing a lalaleo, or Diana, the introductory song syllables, ana, na, na, ana, ana, na, na, ana, which in fact made the detour less jarring, contributing to and thereby continuing Lambert and Penguin's theme or thread of universal patois. Soon after finishing the lalaleo, however, she sped things up, switching from guaguancó to hirabia, a more strictly musical, non-mimetic form, which has been called the bebop of rumba variations. Aunt Nancy was the first to respond to Jeanette's detour, letting the bounding figure go and imitating, in the bass's upper register, a segundo's hirabia pattern. Jamila's synthesizer turned its interred oratorio into a chorus answering Jeanette's lalaleo, a bank of antiphonal echoes Jamila granted galactic reverb, intergalactic reach. I temporized for a few measures before letting my sputters give way to a golden run worthy of Chocolate Armenteros. But it was Lambert who most decisively responded to Jeanette's detour. Removing the clothespins from his lips and putting them in his coat pocket, the clothespins, by the way, had drawn laughter from several people in the audience when the piece began, but they'd gotten used to them and quieted down. He picked up his tenor, put it to his mouth, and motioned for me to pull back. Lambert began by going back to the sputter my golden run had come out of, blowing a barrage of expectorant bleats and pops, not unlike an attack of hiccups. Beginning there, he indeed never left, thriving on what sounded like obstruction, even as he ran the gamut from belly laughs at the horn's low end to a wistful quizzicality in the upper register that at times took him to the spoons. More than Totico's What's Your Name, he appeared to have Frank Lowe's Broadway rumba in mind, rummaging around the horn as though it were a hot potato or a goose's neck, or as though it were a clothespin pinching his tongue. He sustained a blustery tone, bursting, it seemed, with things to say, albeit more things than could be said, it seemed. It was during this solo that the balloons emerged, the first of them lifting heavily out of the bell of the horn, bearing these words. An Egyptian rumba, she said it would be, abstract, angular, undulant, pulse beaten out on a salted cod box. An Egyptian hirabia, she said it would be. No bakongo cloth kicked in a circle, no guaguanco, no lifted skirt edge, no not being caught by the vacunao. A hirabia, no euphemistic vaccine, she said it would be. An Egyptian rumba, ardent, austere. Following the first balloon's emergence, Lambert took a more confidential tack, sputtering as before, but as if under his breath. Resorting to the sotto voce forage he pursues to such resounding effect. It was a more gauzy sound, but one with which he parsed not a whit less, having no less recourse to angles, inversions, and reversals, breaking rumba down, it appeared at points, and by turns putting ba before rum and putting rum before ba, an Egypto-Caribbean conjugation having to do with soul, spirits bearing on soul, souls bearing on spirits. It was at one such point that the second balloon came out of the horn, bearing these words. Isis to his Osiris, I dreamt he stayed inside me all night, forever, stiff, unyielding, she said. Damsel in distress, dread virgin, I lay scared stiff. Ice isn't to my own Isis, stiff but not unyielding, I lay afraid, flat as a board beneath his weight. The balloon disappeared when Lambert, put upon by a strain of quizzicality stronger than any that had come before, paused ever so slightly. When he resumed playing, the third balloon floated up from the bell of the horn, bearing these words. I lay afraid but unafraid, feigning frailty, she said. Stiffness answering stiffness, yielding even so. Faux fragility stiffening him throughout all eternity. Stiff intruder I welcomed in and regaled with my own stiffness. He likes it when I start off stiff and begin to loosen. After the third balloon's emergence, Lambert stepped back from the mic, let the balloon vanish, and put his tenor back in its stand, the audience applauding loudly. Jeanette ever so subtly blushed, as though the balloons had piqued her heart of hearts, but she held her head higher than before, her back straighter than before. She let go of the hirabia pattern. Aunt Nancy returned to the bounding figure. I came back in on trumpet, and we took the piece out, the audience applauding loudly still, as ever. In. Let me switch over to verse and get into this thing that I've been calling the long song. I've been working ever since my second book, exclusively in two serial poems. One called Song of the Andumbulu, taken from a Dogon funeral song, and the other called Mu, taken from a collaboration between Don Cherry, trumpeter, multi-instrumentalist, I guess first came to know playing with Ornette Coleman, and Ed Blackwell, a drummer who was also a part of Ornette's bands. They did a couple of albums called Mu First Part and Mu Second Part. So anyway, these two poems, they're all I do. They're intertwined with one another. I call them twins. Sometimes I call them two and the same, or that they're each other's shadow. One is the dark side to the other's moon, those kinds of ways of putting it. So let me see how much of this I can read. I've forgotten what time I'm supposed to stop, but I won't go on forever. The poems go on forever, but I won't. You want to get caught up in that. I want to read this poem. It's actually post the box set that Jeanne mentioned, Double Trio. So it's been written like in the last year or so. As you can tell from what I've read to this point, I'm obsessed with music. Just, can't be satisfied. Trying to do something that says something about what music does. And maybe even say it in the way that music does. But that's been my, that's been my obsession. And somebody yesterday on the panel cited, I think it was Luke Harley, an Australian critic who says that my work takes place between language and music. And maybe that's true. I was pleased to hear it. If I can get language to move away from language and toward music, okay, I'm good. But I'm going to read you this poem that kind of has been one I've been struggling with since I heard it spoken back when I was 19. The title of the poem, and it's part of the Moo series, it's Moo 244th part, for those of you who are counting. The title is Words Don't Go There. Words don't go there, and it's in quotes. I heard a radio interview when I was 19 with Charles Lloyd, the great reed player, tenor saxophonist, flutist. And I think the occasion was the release of his second or third album, and he was on radio, promoting it. And the announcer, the DJ, was interviewing him. And at one point, I asked him, it was something on the order of, well, could you tell us the essence of what you're trying to convey in your music? It's one of those questions. And there was a pause. Charles Lloyd, pause for him. And then his answer was, words don't go there. And that's all he said. And the announcer moved on. But those words have stayed with me. I even used them, I quoted them in the preface to Moment's Notice, the anthology of jazz, poetry, and prose. That Art Lange and I edited and published about 25 years ago. And so here it is coming back. Very recursive, this long song. Stuff that you thought you had, put to bed, wakes up and starts bugging you again. So this is called Words Don't Go There. Words don't go there in quotes. So it was we came to know of it otherwise, the it that would not submit to our comprehension. A sideways attending to came to seem its legend, the telling we gauge it by. A leafless books or letterless books, narration of our obscurity, of our coming from afar. A book to which words would not go or be seen accruing. A book we couldn't know, but only be. There was a mosaic made of it. Horse trot Bata's iterative hit upside our heads. Angularity's day late come. More of our consolers had left or were leaving. A condition of qualm conducive to blather lined our lips. Calling it music would have only been easy, the it itself hedging the it of it. Long song long on sortilege, there where neither words nor we would go. There was an aboutness to it as it was notwithstanding, the it on whose articulation we demurred, an oracle not of our number among us now. an equation of genital hair with weeds from one whose head spoke from an oven greeted us, against an elixir known as upper loin looks, and against its alchemy. Not that there was no there, but that there was no going there. As if there were not words we said it with, we said, words don't go there. They're gone to by there, but not, a ticket whose trip it took back. There took us there, as we were told it couldn't. There, but not there, or no longer there after being there, or it was words going there, came back to rescind it. Clueless nubs repeal of itself, alike demur, only craven, loud. An abstract accord apportioning the is or the it of it intruded or was introduced, or so we said. So it was, we said. Where words would not go, we went, garlic on our thumbs, caught up in how else it might be. Soulmates could souls meet, who in flesh met seeking suff, tongues wet, mouths entwined. Natal eclipse had come to town. Soul called out to soul, the aleatory advance that was the world, winged it, world otherwise in wait, a kind of abidance. Where words would not go, we went, fervency folded on fervency, a beehive underneath. The underness of it, the it of it, feast of or fraught with, high John in between. Soulmates could souls meet, who in the flesh met short of that, Gnostic shade to be born brought with it. Nub itself so construed, red the red of sunset, sun the sight of blood, that about it not to be absolved. An adjunct or an abject sorcery, where words did not go, but went. Where words would not go, but went, we stood conflicted, a we of whatever magnitude, the many brought down to one. The ithmico-ipsaic natet was on the box, moving us about as if boiling water burned our feet. This was our way of being, the eye of the needle, the eye of the storm, rhapsodic stitcheries, tenuous let. The music's bodily want wove through our bearing. The comely way it had of it, it kept lending us, abroad but for mere dismay. Chant. We took it up with a sheikh who said, in so many words, words don't go there. Don't get me started, he said. The natet broke into a samba, happy sad advance it caught us up in, graduating body and bone, as we always were, part suff, part sigh, part lengthening sigh, longing gave and got its name from. We sat, or we stood, or we lay drifting north, looking up at the sky, carried back, bumpy undernesses, adjutant cloth. A tuneful togetherness made us laugh, sweet squeeze plied with bodily complaint, so blithe it seemed and sounded. Something about love's pure tears they sang, as far as we could make out, an ascending run, encoding all that could be wished for. Sweet squeeze, churchical girth funded forth, an affine of the East, where words didn't go, but came from. It took us up, bumpy underness accelerant, stoked whatever else it could. Another someone so soon gone and too soon gone had come back to console us, a lilt or a sort of sough or a sort of sigh afloat above it all. This was what we were saying exactly. Soulmates could souls meet, as we all were. The natet back from where words went without going. The warble ours no longer was. We were storm petrels, back on lone coast, bird heads on our non-bird bodies. the one coast we were convinced it was, the one clime, rain blown out across islands to the west. It was our host clime, the Natet announced, a stir of words it intimated we spun out from. They're not going there, not ours to avow, we who found our way as we could. Words would not go there, but we who did let in their light, faint as it was. Shepherding the dark we came to at birth was how we thought of it. The way we'd been taught, or were being taught, such the amenities, the rickety amends. The islands we saw put there. The blown away birds we'd be, we saw put there. Rain in such clime we saw picked up and put there. Not the rickety words arbitration, only what was. I stood with my arm around Andrianette's waist in the tableau I repeatedly dreamt, an entablature of touch upon the pillars we put up. Sweet squeeze, churchical girth, put brick upon brick to comprise. Bodily breakdown bit at my heels again, steadied otherwise by churchical girth, the mention of which itself succored body and bone. It was the night before the morning after, the Natet live at the Lullaby Lounge, the very moment churchical embrace began to fade, or had already faded, as it all, we knew, one day would. Chant. Where the words went on refusing, it was there, as bleak as black lives not mattering, the isness of not what the matter was. The abandoned girl had been using again. I put Tower of Power on the box, all but wept. I was in the pain factory, no longer a young man. Two new ones, my left hip, my right foot had shown up. A closer walk with death. The road we were on, everyone was on, some of us acknowledging, some of us not. We went on singing as our bodies broke down, sang as the social body cracked. To want to be touched gave way to grab. I was thinking of a goddess, the thought of whose body was a ship's hull, hers the rotundity of an oud's back, the school we were sometimes in. Where words went but would not go, we took our seats. To sit the closer walk we'd heard about, it turned out, what would and would not go there. It verged on being more than we could bear, verged though we ourselves did as well, an answering verge or an upping the ante, intimating more than was there. The book of soul seemed in play once again. Soul's equanimity, soul's would it were so. The surrender, such as it was as well. We were singing, chanting down, would it were so, chanting such as it was down. We came down on words don't go there as well. All it was words. Where words went made soul matter, the spirit whose letter we were. What would be a book bound with wire tested our thumbs, that was nowhere apparent, recondite our wayness at the moment's core. They were saying words don't go there again, as happy trails out of hothouse Europe came ashore, the they who were otherwise we. The sound of breakdown found us chronophobic, as afraid of Our Lady Tet at the thought of time passing. The sight of her cutaway wrinkles gave us pause. The not Tet's runaway croon, our benediction. Tet in no way stoic, nor we. Such as it was, it occurred to us to say, crow-footed complacency, runaway croon's complaint. Words would not, we saw, go there, but were we birds. Birds not to be looked in the eye we now were, heads back, beaks up. Words going there, we squawked. A closer walk, but long we hoped, not knowing what time was left. Was bodily life all there was, we wondered? Discarded crutches lay in a room thick with candle smoke. So close a walk they lost their legs, we heard of those whose crutches they were. A spendthrift cosmos, it seemed. We were there where we didn't go. Word the only word to be trusted. What if words were of the realm of the dead, we were thinking, their way of having stayed behind, ideal absence, ideal inhabitants, the heaven we'd heard about. Soulmates could souls meet, who in flesh met, made it so. The thought they wore nothing underneath what soul was. Nakedness more naked than nakedness. What else, if not what words were? I was very moved to hear Will. I hate to keep bringing you into this, man, but I was very moved to hear Will say yesterday that I take my time. I remember Whitney Houston talking about that great rendition of the national anthem that Marvin Gaye gave. That was before a boxing match, right? It was a Hearns-Hagler fight or something like that? Yeah. And she was trying to talk about how special it was, and she couldn't find the words, and finally she said, "He took his time." And that said it. So I'm going to take a little bit more time. Let me go out on this one. I think I can get read in 10 minutes. It's going to appear in the issue of Conjunctions that's coming out in November, I think, called Earth Elegies. And so I guess it's an Earth elegy. And being here in this beautiful natural environment, I couldn't help but think of it. In the course of this double trio, certain forms come up and, they recur. And one developed that's called Etude Ending Soon Come, Rebegun, which means that the first section ends with the word soon come, but the poem doesn't end there. It's rebegun by the next section. So this is the third Etude Ending Soon Come, Rebegun. New 209th part. We were a search party the next time out. We scouted retribution and remunerative states we would all pass through, try though we might to rise above. Sprung similitude put us on parallel tracks. Allegory might have been its name, but it wasn't. To make it mean something was our aim. To make it mean was to make it more real, more than real, real abound itself. We came to a moonlit stretch, dry scrub underfoot, those known as the flown ones down for the night. They lay dreaming about the bodies of the proper ones, a new notion come into their heads, a new recognition while they slept, spawn of a tribe yet to come. We lay the same we saw, parallel in spite of